In the shadowed halls of Letherby Grange, a scream pierces the calm of a perfect English afternoon. A wealthy widow lies dead, a blood-stained candlestick at her side. Was it greed, jealousy, or a secret too dark to stay buried? As whispers of betrayal echo, Miss Jane Marple steps into the mystery, her quiet eyes seeing what others miss. Who among the polished guests is hiding a killer's heart? Unravel the truth in novel secrets and surprising twists if you dare. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Letherby Grange. In the quiet village of Chipping Cleghorn, where the hedgerows bloomed with the last of summer's bounty, and the church clock ticked with unhurried precision, Letherby Grange stood as a monument to a fading era. The Georgian manor, with its ivy-clad walls and tall sash windows, was the pride of the widowed Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne, whose fortune and impeccable taste were the envy of the county. On this crisp September morning in 1949, the Grange buzzed with an unusual energy, for Mrs. Ashbourne was hosting a weekend gathering, a reunion of sorts for a select circle of friends and family, though the air carried a faint undercurrent of unease. The drawing-room, adorned with chintz curtains and polished mahogany, was a picture of elegance. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow over the assembled guests, who sipped tea or sherry with the studied politeness of those who know each other too well, or perhaps not well enough. Mrs. Ashbourne, a statuesque woman in her late 50s, presided over the group with a regal smile, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She wore a sapphire brooch that caught the light, a family heirloom said to be worth a small fortune. At her side was her nephew, Lionel Ashbourne, a lean, restless man of 35, whose charming smile did little to mask the dissatisfaction in his eyes. Lionel, a stockbroker with a penchant for risky investments, had recently returned from London under a cloud of financial whispers. Opposite him sat Dr. Cedric Marlowe, the village physician, a man of quiet authority whose spectacles and neatly trimmed beard gave him an air of scholarly detachment. His wife, Eleanor, a nervous woman with darting eyes, clutched her teacup as though it were a lifeline. Then there was Miss Clara Vernon, a spinster of indeterminate age, whose sharp tongue and encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip made her both indispensable and insufferable. She perched on a velvet settee, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she surveyed the room. Beside her lounged Captain Ralph Haverford, a retired naval officer whose ruddy complexion and hearty laugh belied a reputation for ruthless ambition. His young fiancée, Sylvia Grey, a striking beauty with auburn hair and a penchant for expensive dresses, seemed out of place among the older set, her laughter a touch too bright. The final guest was the Reverend Timothy Blackwood, a gentle soul whose absent-minded demeanour concealed a keen interest in human nature. He sat by the window, his Bible open on his lap, though his eyes strayed often to the others, as if searching for something unspoken. The conversation at first was all politeness, talk of the harvest festival, the new vicarage roof, and the unseasonably warm weather. But beneath the civility, tension simmered. Lionel's forced joviality grated on Dr. Marlowe, who responded with clipped precision. Eleanor Marlowe's hands trembled as she passed a plate of scones, and Sylvia's flirtatious glances at Lionel did not go unnoticed by Captain Haverford, whose jaw tightened imperceptibly. It was Miss Vernon who first hinted at the undercurrents. "I hear, Lionel," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a well-aimed dart, "that your latest venture in the city didn't quite go as planned. One does wonder how you managed to keep up appearances." Lionel's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "My dear Clara, the stock market is a game of patience. One mustn't believe every rumour." Mrs. Ashbourne intervened, her tone smooth but firm. "Let us not spoil our gathering with talk of business. We are here to enjoy each other's company, are we not?" The room murmured agreement, but the air grew heavier. Sylvia excused herself to fetch a shawl, and Captain Haverford watched her go with a flicker of suspicion. Dr. Marlowe adjusted his spectacles, his gaze lingering on Lionel, while Eleanor whispered something to her husband that made him frown. The Reverend Blackwood, sensing the shift, began a rambling anecdote about a lost sheep, but no one listened. At precisely 4 o'clock, as the church clock chimed in the distance, a scream shattered the uneasy calm. It came from the library, a room adjacent to the drawing-room, where Sylvia had gone moments before. The guests froze, teacups clattering in their saucers. Captain Haverford was the first to move, striding toward the door with a soldier's decisiveness. The others followed, their footsteps echoing on the polished oak floor. In the library, they found Sylvia standing over a crumpled figure on the Persian rug. It was Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne, her sapphire brooch glinting in the dim light, her face pale and lifeless. A thin trickle of blood seeped from a wound at her temple, and a heavy silver candlestick lay beside her, its base stained red. "She's dead!" Sylvia gasped, her hands pressed to her mouth. I came in, and she was just lying there." Dr. Marlowe knelt beside the body, his fingers searching for a pulse. After a moment, he shook his head. "She's gone. A blow to the head, I'd wager. This is murder." The word hung in the air, sharp and final. Lionel staggered back, his face ashen. Eleanor clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Miss Vernon's knitting needles stilled, her lips pursed in grim satisfaction, as though she had expected no less. Captain Haverford's fists clenched, and the Reverend Blackwood murmured a prayer, his voice trembling. "Who was the last to see her?" Captain Haverford demanded, his voice booming. "She was with us not 10 minutes ago." "I saw her slip away," Miss Vernon said coolly. "She mentioned needing to fetch something from the library. I thought nothing of it." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, each silently calculating their own movements. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking the time, 4:02 p.m. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked and the wind rattled the windows, as if the Grange itself were whispering its secrets. It was then that the butler, a stooped man named Parsons, entered, his face pale. "Madam, gentlemen, there's a lady at the door, a Miss Marple. She says she's expected." The guests turned, startled. Mrs. Ashbourne had mentioned no such visitor. Yet, in the chaos of the moment, no one thought to question it. The stage was set, the players assembled, and into this scene of death and deception, Miss Jane Marple would soon step, her quiet demeanour masking the sharpest of minds. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The library at Letherby Grange was a room of sombre elegance, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes, and its air heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax polish. The late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's body lay. The silver candlestick, its base still stained with blood, gleamed dully beside her, a mute witness to the violence that had shattered the tranquillity of the day. The guests stood in a loose semicircle, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and something less definable. Perhaps the flicker of guilt. Sylvia Grey, her auburn hair dishevelled, stood trembling near the fireplace, her eyes fixed on the body as though unable to look away. Captain Haverford hovered protectively at her side, his jaw set, though his gaze darted to the others searching for answers. Dr. Cedric Marlowe, having confirmed Mrs. Ashbourne's death, stood with clinical detachment, his hands clasped behind his back. His wife, Eleanor, clung to his arm, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Lionel Ashbourne leaned against a bookcase, his face pale and his fingers twitching as though craving a cigarette. Miss Clara Vernon, her knitting abandoned on a nearby chair, surveyed the scene with a hawk-like intensity, her lips pursed. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood stood apart, his hands folded in prayer, though his eyes betrayed a quiet curiosity. The butler, Parsons, reappeared at the door, his usual composure frayed. "Miss Marple, madam," he announced, stepping aside to reveal a small, elderly woman dressed in a neat tweed suit, her white hair tucked beneath a sensible hat. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, took in the room, with a single sweeping glance that missed nothing. Miss Jane Marple stepped forward, her movements unhurried but precise, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft yet clear, carrying the gentle cadence of a country spinster. "I am so sorry to arrive at such a distressing moment. I was invited by Mrs. Ashbourne to join your gathering, though it seems fate has other plans." The guests stared, momentarily thrown by her calm demeanour. Captain Haverford recovered first, his military bearing asserting itself. "Miss Marple, is it? I'm afraid you've walked into a tragedy. Mrs. Ashbourne has been murdered." "So I see," Miss Marple replied, her eyes resting briefly on the body before moving to the candlestick. "A dreadful business. Has anyone sent for the police?" "I've telephoned Inspector Craddock," Dr. Marlowe said, his tone measured. "He should arrive shortly. Until then, we've been instructed not to touch anything." "Quite right," Miss Marple said, nodding approvingly. She moved closer to the body, her steps light, almost delicate, as though unwilling to disturb the scene. "A candlestick, I see. Heavy and most effective, I should think. Was it kept here in the library?" "Yes," Lionel answered, his voice strained. "It's one of a pair. The other is on the mantel." He gestured toward the fireplace, where a matching candlestick stood, its silver surface gleaming in the firelight. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the candlestick, then moved to the room itself. The library was spacious, with two entrances, one leading to the drawing room, where the guests had been gathered, and another to a narrow corridor that connected to the main hall. A large oak desk stood against one wall, its surface cluttered with papers, a fountain pen, and a small crystal inkwell. A single window was slightly ajar, letting in a cool breeze that stirred the curtains. Miss Marple noted the position of the furniture. A velvet-upholstered chair tipped slightly askew, a book lying open on the floor, its pages fluttering faintly. "Mrs. Ashbourne was found just as you see her?" Miss Marple asked, turning to Sylvia, who nodded, her hands twisting together. "I came to fetch my shawl," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "I'd left it here earlier. I walked in and there she was. I screamed, and the others came running. "And the time?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "It was just after 4, Captain Haverford said. The church clock had struck moments before Sylvia screamed." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And you were all in the drawing-room together until then?" A brief silence followed, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Miss Vernon spoke up, her voice sharp. "Most of us were. Mrs. Ashbourne slipped away to the library a few minutes before. She said she needed to fetch something, a letter, I believe." "A letter?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Did she say what it was about?" "No," Miss Vernon replied, her eyes narrowing, "but she seemed preoccupied, not herself." Miss Marple, Dustin turned to Lionel. "As her nephew, Mr. Ashbourne, did you notice anything unusual in her behaviour today?" Lionel hesitated, his fingers brushing his tie. "She was a bit distant, perhaps, but Aunt Lavinia was always a private woman. I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Dr. Marlowe. "And you, Doctor? You examined her? Was there anything else you observed?" Dr. Marlowe adjusted his spectacles, his tone precise. "The blow to the temple was fatal, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous, or nearly so. Beyond that, I'd prefer to leave the details to the police surgeon." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. She glanced at Eleanor, who had remained silent, her face pale. "Mrs. Marlowe, you seem distressed. Did you know Mrs. Ashbourne well?" Eleanor started, her eyes darting to her husband. "Oh, yes, we were friends. It's just so awful. Who could do such a thing?" "Who, indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting back to the body. She bent slightly, as though to adjust her shoe, but her eyes scanned the rug, noting a faint smudge near the candlestick, a mark that might have been overlooked in the chaos. The sound of a car crunching on the gravel drive announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a brisk, no-nonsense man with a reputation for efficiency. He entered the library with a constable in tow, his eyes taking in the scene with practised speed. After a brief introduction, he turned to Miss Marple, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Miss Marple, I believe? I've heard of you. You've a knack for these sorts of things, haven't you?" "Oh, I'm merely an observer," Miss Marple said, her smile self-deprecating. "But I do find that people are often careless with the truth. It's the little things that give them away." Inspector Craddock nodded, though his attention quickly shifted to the body. He began issuing orders to the constable, who set about securing the room. Miss Marple stepped back, her presence almost forgotten, as the guests were ushered into the drawing-room to await questioning. But her mind was already at work, cataloguing the details, the candlestick, the smudge, the letter, the alibis, and the fleeting expressions of those around her. As she followed the others, her eyes lingered on the open book on the floor. Its pages were turned to a passage from Shakespeare, and though she could not read it from where she stood, she made a mental note to examine it later. For Miss Jane Marple knew that in a house like Letherby Grange, where secrets were as plentiful as the shadows, the truth often hid in the smallest of details. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Miss Marple's Insight. The drawing-room at Letherby Grange, so recently a scene of polite conversation, now felt like a stage where each player awaited their cue with bated breath. The fire still crackled in the grate, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the guests. They sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting toward the library door, where Inspector Craddock and his constable were examining the scene of Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder. The silver tea service sat untouched, the scones growing stale, and the air was thick with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-back chair near the window, appeared almost invisible in her quiet simplicity. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her knitting bag at her feet, and her expression one of gentle concern. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, moved from one guest to another, noting the way Lionel Ashbourne's fingers drummed nervously on his knee, the way Eleanor Marlowe's gaze flickered toward her husband, and the way Captain Haverford stood rigidly by Sylvia Grey, as though guarding a treasure he feared might slip away. Inspector Craddock emerged from the library, his notebook in hand, his face set in a grim line. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually," he announced, his voice crisp. "We'll use the morning room for interviews. Parsons, please ensure no one leaves the house." The butler nodded, his face pale but composed, and retreated to carry out his orders. The guests murmured among themselves, their voices low and tense. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her attention drawn to the small details of the room, the ticking of the ormolu clock, which read 4:45 p.m., the faint scent of lavender from a bowl of potpourri, and the way Miss Clara Vernon's sharp eyes followed Inspector Craddock as he crossed the room. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, pausing beside her chair, "I understand you arrived just after the incident. Did you know Mrs. Ashbourne well?" "Oh, scarcely at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "We met some years ago at a charity bazaar in St. Mary Mead. She was kind enough to invite me for the weekend, though I confess I was surprised. I am, after all, a rather unremarkable guest." Craddock's lips twitched, as though he suspected there was nothing unremarkable about her. "And yet here you are, at the scene of a murder. Any observations you'd care to share?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector, and that a house like this, so full of history, often holds secrets in its corners." Craddock nodded, filing her words away, and turned to address the group. "I'll start with you, Miss Grey. If you'll follow me, please." Sylvia rose, her movements graceful but unsteady, and followed Craddock to the morning room. The others watched her go, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. Miss Marple, however, turned her attention to the book she had noticed in the library, the one lying open on the floor. She excused herself quietly, murmuring something about needing fresh air, and slipped back into the library, where the constable stood guard. "May I look at that book, young man?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "I shan't touch anything else, I promise." The constable, a young man with an earnest face, hesitated but nodded. "Just don't move it, ma'am." Miss Marple knelt beside the book, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, and noted the open page, Macbeth, Act 2, Scene 2. The lines were familiar, but one phrase stood out, underlined faintly in pencil. "Sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep." She tilted her head, her mind racing. Had Mrs. Ashbourne marked this passage, or had someone else left it as a message or a taunt? She returned to the drawing-room just as Sylvia emerged from the morning room, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. Captain Haverford was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm. "What did they ask you, darling?" he said, his voice low but urgent. "Oh, just where I was, what I saw," Sylvia replied, her voice trembling. "I told them I found her like that. I didn't touch anything." "Of course you didn't," Haverford said, though his tone held a trace of doubt. Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened briefly on Sylvia's arm, and the way Sylvia's eyes darted away as though avoiding his gaze. One by one, the guests were called to the morning room. Lionel went next, his shoulders slumped as though carrying a great weight. Dr. Marlowe followed, his answers crisp and professional, though Miss Marple noticed the way his hands fidgeted with his watch chain. Eleanor's interview was brief, her voice barely audible through the closed door. Miss Vernon strode in with the confidence of one who had nothing to hide or everything to conceal. The Reverend Blackwood was last, his gentle demeanour unchanged, though his hands trembled slightly as he returned. When Craddock rejoined the group, he looked weary but determined. "We've established a preliminary timeline," he said. "Mrs. Ashbourne was last seen alive at approximately 3:50 p.m., when she left the drawing-room to go to the library. Miss Gray found her at 4:02 p.m., just after the church clock struck. That leaves a window of about 12 minutes for the crime to have occurred. I'll need your exact movements during that time." A murmur of protest rose from the group. "Surely you don't suspect us," Lionel said, his voice sharp. "We were all here, together." "Were you?" Craddock asked, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Vernon says Mrs. Ashbourne left the room alone. Did anyone else leave during those 12 minutes?" A heavy silence fell. Eleanor's voice broke it, barely a whisper. I stepped out to the powder room, but only for a moment. And I went to fetch my pipe from the hall," Captain Haverford admitted, his tone gruff. "But I was back before the scream." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though she said nothing. She noted the way Lionel avoided meeting Craddock's gaze, and the way Miss Vernon's lips twitched as though suppressing a smile. The Reverend Blackwood cleared his throat. "I was by the window reading. I didn't notice anyone leave." Craddock made a note, his expression unreadable. "We'll verify these alibis. In the meantime, I'd ask you all to remain here at the Grange. No one leaves until we've sorted this out." As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning over the details. The underlined passage, the smudge on the rug, the candlestick, and the letter Mrs. Ashbourne had gone to fetch. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once remarked that people in villages were much the same as people in grand houses, full of secrets and all too human. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The truth, she knew, lay not in the grand gestures, but in the small, careless moments that people failed to guard. Chapter 4. The questions deepen. The evening shadows lengthened across Letherby Grange, casting the drawing-room in a muted glow as the guests reconvened under Inspector Craddock's watchful eye. The air was thick with tension, the earlier politeness replaced by a brittle unease. The ormolu clock on the mantel ticked towards 6:30 p.m., its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the restless shifting of those seated around the room. Miss Jane Marple, perched on her chair by the window, seemed almost a part of the furniture, her quiet presence unnoticed by most. Yet her eyes, sharp and attentive, missed nothing. Not the way Lionel Ashbourne's fingers toyed with a loose thread at his cuff, nor the way Sylvia Gray's gaze darted toward the library door, as though expecting Mrs. Ashbourne to reappear. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his expression one of patient determination. "I've spoken to each of you," he began, his voice steady, "and we've established that Mrs. Ashbourne was killed between 3:50 and 4:02 p.m. The candlestick was the weapon, and it was taken from this very room. What I need now is clarity on your movements and any details, however small, that might shed light on this crime." Captain Haverford cleared his throat, his military bearing intact despite the strain in his eyes. "I've told you, Inspector. I stepped into the hall to fetch my pipe. I was gone perhaps 2 minutes, no more. I heard nothing unusual. And you, Mr. Ashbourne?" Craddock turned to Lionel, whose face had taken on a waxy pallor. "I was here," Lionel said, his voice clipped, "in the drawing-room, the entire time. Ask anyone." Miss Clara Vernon's knitting needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her sharp tone. "I'm not so sure about that, Lionel. You are fidgeting something dreadful, and I recall you stepping toward the door just before Lavinia left. Said you needed to stretch your legs." Lionel's eyes flashed with irritation. "I may have stood up, Clara, but I didn't leave the room. You're mistaken. Am I?" Miss Vernon's lips curled slightly, her gaze unyielding. "My eyes are quite sharp, you know." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was cataloguing every word. She noted the way Eleanor Marlowe's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white, and the way Dr. Marlowe's gaze lingered on his wife, as though assessing her fragility. The Reverend Blackwood, seated near the bookcase, seemed lost in thought, his fingers tracing the edge of his Bible. "Mrs. Marlowe," Craddock said, turning to Eleanor, "you mentioned stepping out to the powder room. Can you be precise about the time?" Eleanor's eyes widened, and she glanced at her husband before answering. "It was just before 4, I think. I was only gone a moment. I heard the clock chime as I returned." "And did you see Mrs. Ashbourne on your way?" Craddock pressed. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw no one." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. Eleanor's hesitation, she thought, was not merely fear. It was the hesitation of someone guarding a secret. She made a mental note to speak with the young woman later, perhaps over a cup of tea, when defences might be lowered. Craddock turned to Sylvia Grey, whose beauty seemed dimmed by the weight of the day. "Miss Grey, you found the body. You said you went to the library to fetch your shawl. Did you notice anything unusual before you saw Mrs. Ashbourne?" Sylvia's hands fluttered to her throat, where a pearl necklace gleamed faintly. "No, nothing." The room was quiet. I saw the shawl on a chair, and then I saw her. It was awful. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the necklace, a delicate piece that seemed oddly formal for a country weekend. She wondered if it was a gift, and if so, from whom. Sylvia's distress seemed genuine, but there was a theatrical quality to it, like a young woman accustomed to being the centre of attention. "And you, Reverend?" Craddock asked, turning to Blackwood. "You were by the window reading. Did you see anyone leave or return?" The Reverend blinked, as though startled to be addressed. "I'm afraid I was rather absorbed in my reading," he said, his voice gentle. "I didn't notice much, though I do recall Mrs. Ashbourne leaving the room. She seemed preoccupied." Miss Marple nodded to herself. The Reverend's absent-mindedness, she suspected, was not as complete as he claimed. People like Timothy Blackwood, she had learned, often saw more than they let on, their quietness a mask for keen observation. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "Very well. I'll need to speak with the staff next. Parsons, the maids, anyone who might have seen or heard something. In the meantime, I ask that you remain cooperative and stay within the grounds." As Craddock moved to summon the butler, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate. "Inspector, if I may," she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "Might I take a closer look at the library? I promise not to disturb anything." Craddock hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple, but stay with the constable, and don't touch anything." Miss Marple smiled her thanks and made her way to the library, where the constable stood guard. The room was as she had left it, the body now covered with a sheet, the candlestick still in place. She moved to the oak desk, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across its surface. Most were innocuous: bills, invitations, a draft of a letter to a solicitor. But one item caught her attention. A small folded note tucked beneath the inkwell, its edge slightly crumpled. With the constable's permission, she used a handkerchief to lift the note and unfold it. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smudged. "Meet me in the library at 3:45. We must discuss the will." It was unsigned, but the paper bore the faint scent of lavender, the same scent as the potpourri in the drawing-room. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A meeting about a will, she thought, was rarely innocent. She returned the note to its place and turned her attention to the open window. The latch was loose, and a faint scuff mark marred the sill, as though someone had climbed through, or at least considered it. She made a mental note to ask Parsons about the groundskeepers and whether the garden path below showed any signs of disturbance. As she left the library, she passed Sylvia Grey in the hall, who was adjusting her shawl, a silk creation that seemed more suited to a London drawing-room than a country manor. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must be terribly shaken. Might I offer you a cup of tea? It does wonders for the nerves." Sylvia hesitated, then nodded, her eyes wary. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That's very kind." As they walked toward the morning room, Miss Marple's mind was already turning over the pieces of the puzzle. The note, the scuff mark, the underlined passage in Macbeth, and the alibis that seemed just a little too neat. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had once said that people in a panic often told the truth by mistake. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The truth, she knew, was beginning to stir, like a shadow moving just out of sight. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspicion. The morning room at Letherby Grange, with its pale green walls and delicate chinoiserie wallpaper, was a haven of calm compared to the oppressive atmosphere of the drawing-room. A small fire burned in the grate, and the scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint lavender from Sylvia Grey's shawl as she sat opposite Miss Jane Marple. The clock on the mantel read 7:15 p.m., and outside the September dusk had settled over Chipping Cleghorn, cloaking the manor's gardens in a soft violet haze. Yet, within the room, the air was charged with unspoken questions. Miss Marple poured tea with the practised ease of one who had navigated countless such moments, her movements precise yet unhurried. "Milk, my dear?" she asked Sylvia, her tone warm but her eyes keenly observant. "Yes, please," Sylvia replied, her voice subdued. Her fingers, adorned with a single emerald ring, trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. "This is all so dreadful. I keep seeing her, lying there." "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, her expression sympathetic. "It must have been a terrible shock, finding poor Mrs. Ashbourne like that. You were very brave to stay so composed." Sylvia's eyes flickered, and she took a sip of tea as though buying time. "I don't feel brave. I feel helpless. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze gentle but probing. "People do surprising things when they feel cornered, my dear. I once knew a young woman in St. Mary Mead, quite like you in some ways, who found herself in a terrible tangle over a misunderstanding. It's the little pressures that reveal so much." Sylvia's lips parted, but no words came. She set her cup down, the saucer clinking faintly. Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders stiffened, as though bracing for an unseen blow. Before she could press further, the door opened, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face grim. "Miss Marple, Miss Grey," he said, nodding. "I've just spoken with the staff. Parsons confirms that no one entered or left the house during the critical time, and the maids saw nothing unusual. The groundskeeper, however, mentioned a figure in the garden around 3:45 p.m. Too far to identify, but it's something." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The garden, you say? Was the window in the library open when you arrived, Inspector?" Craddock nodded. "It was ajar. We've checked for prints, but the sill is clean. Too clean, perhaps?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind returning to the scuff marks she had noticed earlier. A clean sill suggested someone had taken care to cover their tracks, someone who knew the house well enough to move quickly and quietly. Sylvia shifted in her seat, her hands smoothing her shawl. "The garden! But surely no one from outside could have—" Her voice trailed off, and she glanced at the door as though expecting an interruption. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Miss Grey, you mentioned earlier that you went to the library to fetch your shawl. Was it a habit of yours to leave it there?" Sylvia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the fabric. "Not exactly. I'd been reading in the library earlier that day, and I must have left it behind. It's my favourite shawl." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shawl, its silk threads catching the firelight. "A lovely piece," she said softly. "A gift, perhaps?" Sylvia flushed, her eyes darting away. "Yes, from a friend in London. It's nothing special." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. The shawl, she thought, was far too fine for a casual gift, and Sylvia's evasiveness suggested there was more to the story. She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through Parsons, who had a way of knowing the household's comings and goings. Craddock excused himself to continue his interviews, leaving Miss Marple and Sylvia alone once more. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her thoughts were on the note she had found in the library, the one about the will. She decided to test the waters. "My dear," she said, her voice gentle, "Mrs. Ashbourne mentioned a letter she went to fetch. Did she ever speak to you about her will, or any changes she might have been considering?" Sylvia's cup rattled in its saucer, and she set it down quickly. "Her will? No, she never mentioned it to me. Why would she?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "It's just that people of Mrs. Ashbourne's age often think of such things. I once knew a lady in St. Mary Mead who rewrote her will 3 times in a month, each time because of some new quarrel. It caused quite a stir. Sylvia managed a weak smile, but her eyes were guarded. Miss Marple did not press further, sensing that the young woman was on edge. Instead, she rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think I'll take a turn about the room, my dear. These old bones need a little movement." As Sylvia nodded and excused herself, Miss Marple moved to the window, her eyes scanning the darkening garden beyond. The path beneath the library window was barely visible, but she could make out the faint outline of a flower bed, its earth freshly turned. She wondered if the groundskeeper's mysterious figure had left any trace. A footprint, perhaps, or a broken twig. Returning to the drawing room, she found the other guests gathered, their conversations hushed and strained. Lionel was pacing near the fireplace, his face drawn. Dr. Marlowe and Eleanor sat close together, their heads bent in quiet discussion. Miss Vernon's knitting needles had resumed their rhythm, her eyes darting over the group like a hawk's. Captain Haverford stood by the door, his posture rigid, while the Reverend Blackwood leafed through his Bible, his lips moving silently. Miss Marple took her seat, her mind turning over the clues. The note, the shawl, the scuff mark, the underlined passage in Macbeth. She thought of the tensions she had observed. Lionel's financial troubles, Sylvia's evasive glances, Eleanor's nervous tremors, and Haverford's possessive demeanour. Each guest, she knew, had a motive, whether it was money, love, or revenge. But the key, she suspected, lay in the timing. Those critical 12 minutes when Mrs. Ashbourne had met her end. As the clock struck 7:30 p.m., Parsons entered, announcing dinner. The guests rose reluctantly, their appetites dulled by the day's events. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but purposeful. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once said that a village was like a stage, with everyone playing a part. At Letherby Grange, the curtain had risen on a tragedy, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the script before the final act. Chapter 6. A clue in the details. Dinner at Letherby Grange was a subdued affair. The long mahogany table set with gleaming silver and fine china that seemed almost mocking in the wake of tragedy. The guests sat in their assigned places, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight, but the usual chatter of a country house gathering was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional murmur of polite necessity. Miss Jane Marple, seated between the Reverend Timothy Blackwood and Miss Clara Vernon, observed the group with her usual quiet intensity, her eyes noting every glance, every hesitation, every gesture that betrayed more than words could. The clock on the dining room mantel read 8:15 p.m., its steady ticking a reminder of the hours slipping by since Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder. Inspector Craddock had joined the party briefly, his presence a sombre reminder of the investigation, but he had excused himself to confer with the police surgeon, leaving the guests to their meal and their thoughts. Parsons, the butler, moved silently around the table, serving a consommé that went largely untouched. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the small details, the way Lionel Ashbourne's hand shook as he lifted his wine-glass, the way Sylvia Grey's eyes darted towards Captain Haverford whenever he spoke, and the way Eleanor Marlowe's fork paused mid-air, as though she had forgotten how to eat. Dr. Marlowe, ever the composed physician, maintained a calm facade, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on his wife, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Miss Vernon, her knitting set aside for the meal, was less restrained. "It's a disgrace," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Lavinia murdered in her own home, and we're all sitting here like sheep, waiting for the police to point fingers. Someone in this room knows more than they're saying." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Lionel's glass clattered against his plate, and he glared at Miss Vernon. "That's a dangerous thing to say, Clara. You're not exactly above suspicion yourself, always poking into everyone's business." Miss Vernon's eyes narrowed, but her smile was cold. "I observe, Lionel. It's not a crime to notice things, unlike other activities you might be familiar with." "Enough!" Captain Haverford snapped, his voice booming. "This isn't the time for bickering. Lavinia's dead, and we're all under scrutiny. Let's not make it worse." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise, though her mind was cataloguing the exchange. Miss Vernon's barb had struck a nerve, and Lionel's defensiveness suggested more than mere irritation. She made a mental note to inquire about his financial troubles. Rumours of bad investments had reached even St. Mary Mead, and she wondered how desperate his situation might be. The Reverend Blackwood, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "Let us try to find some grace in this moment," he said softly. "Mrs. Ashbourne would not want us to turn on one another." His words were met with nods, but the tension remained. Miss Marple sipped her water, her eyes drifting to the centrepiece, a silver apricot filled with late summer roses. One petal had fallen onto the tablecloth, its edge curled and slightly bruised, as though it had been plucked and discarded. It reminded her of the smudge on the library rug, a small detail that seemed out of place in the otherwise pristine room. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She slipped into the hall, her steps light, and made her way to the library, where the constable had been replaced by a young sergeant. "May I take another look, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I'm trying to recall something Mrs. Ashbourne mentioned about her books." The sergeant, clearly unsure but swayed by her unassuming demeanour, nodded. "Just don't touch anything, ma'am." Miss Marple moved to the oak desk, her eyes scanning the papers once more. The note about the will was still there, tucked beneath the inkwell. Its lavender scent, faint but unmistakable. She turned her attention to the open copy of Macbeth, still lying on the floor, its underlined passage, "Sleep no more! Macbeth does murder sleep," etched in her mind. She bent closer, careful not to disturb the book, and noticed something she had missed earlier. A faint pencil mark in the margin, a single word, "guilt." The word sent a shiver through her. Was it a clue left by Mrs. Ashbourne, or a taunt from the killer? She thought of her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once remarked that people often betrayed themselves in the smallest ways, like a gardener who couldn't resist tidying a flower bed even after committing a crime. Miss Marple straightened, her gaze drifting to the window. The scuff mark on the sill was still there, and she noted a faint trace of dirt on the rug below, as though someone had stepped inside from the garden. Returning to the drawing-room, she found the guests in a state of uneasy calm. Sylvia was seated near the fire, her shawl draped over her shoulders, while Captain Haverford stood by the window, his back to the room. Lionel was pouring himself a brandy, his movements jerky, while Dr. Marlowe and Eleanor spoke in low tones near the bookcase. Miss Vernon's knitting needles clicked relentlessly, and the Reverend Blackwood sat with his Bible, his eyes distant. Miss Marple took her seat, her mind turning over the clues. The note, the underlined passage. The word guilt, the scuff mark, and the petal on the tablecloth. She thought of the alibis, so carefully stated yet so conveniently vague. Eleanor's trip to the powder room, Haverford's fetch for his pipe, Lionel's claim to have stayed in the room. Each could be true, or each could hide a lie. As the clock struck 9 p.m., Inspector Craddock returned, his face weary but determined. "I've spoken with the police surgeon," he announced. "Mrs. Ashbourne died from a single blow to the temple, delivered with force. The candlestick matches the wound perfectly. We've also found no signs of forced entry, which suggests the killer was someone already in the house, or someone who knew how to enter unnoticed." A murmur rippled through the group. Sylvia's hand flew to her throat, and Lionel's glass paused at his lips. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her thoughts on the garden path and the figure the groundskeeper had seen. She knew that the truth was beginning to take shape, like a pattern emerging from a tangled skein of wool. The killer, she suspected, had made one small mistake, a detail so minor it might go unnoticed by all but the most observant. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the ormolu clock. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who had once said that time was the great revealer of secrets. At Letherby Grange, time was ticking, and Miss Marple was determined to listen to its whispers. Chapter 7. Lies and Hidden Truths. The night had settled heavily over Letherby Grange, the moon casting a pale glow through the tall windows of the drawing-room, where the guests had gathered once more after a restless attempt at sleep. The ormolu clock on the mantel read 10:30 p.m., its ticking a relentless reminder of the hours since Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder. The air was thick with suspicion, and the fire's warmth did little to ease the chill of distrust that hung over the group. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, her eyes sharp and attentive beneath her serene expression. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook in hand, his face etched with the weariness of a man who knew the truth was close yet maddeningly elusive. The guests sat in a loose circle, their postures tense. Lionel Ashbourne slouched in an armchair, his eyes darting nervously. Sylvia Grey perched on the edge of a settee, her shawl clutched tightly. Captain Haverford stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set. Dr. Cedric Marlowe and his wife Eleanor sat close together, her hand resting on his arm. Miss Clara Vernon's knitting needles paused, her gaze piercing. And the Reverend Timothy Blackwood leafed through his Bible, his lips moving silently. "I've reviewed your statements," Craddock began, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm troubled by inconsistencies. Someone here is not telling the full truth. Mrs. Ashbourne was killed in a narrow window of time, and every one of you claims to have an alibi. Yet the facts suggest otherwise." Lionel straightened, his voice sharp. "What are you implying, Inspector? We've told you where we were. You can't just accuse us without evidence." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Evidence, Mr. Ashbourne, is precisely what I'm seeking. For instance, you claim you never left the drawing room, yet Miss Vernon saw you step toward the door. Care to explain?" Lionel flushed, his fingers tightening on the armrest. "I told you. I stood up to stretch my legs. I didn't go anywhere. Clara's imagination is running wild, as usual." Miss Vernon's lips curled into a thin smile. "My imagination, Lionel. I saw you move toward the library door just as Lavinia left, and you were gone longer than a mere stretch requires." "That's a lie," Lionel snapped, his voice rising. "I was back before the scream." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes flickering with interest. Lionel's anger, she noted, had a desperate edge, as though he feared more than just suspicion. She thought of the note about the will, tucked beneath the inkwell, and wondered if Lionel's financial troubles had driven him to desperation. Craddock turned to Eleanor Marlowe, whose pale face seemed almost translucent in the firelight. "Mrs. Marlowe, you said you went to the powder room just before 4. Yet the maid, Jenny, claims she was cleaning the hallway at that time and saw no one pass." Eleanor's eyes widened, and she clutched her husband's arm. I must have been mistaken about the time. It was so quick, I barely noticed." Dr. Marlowe's hand covered hers, his voice calm but firm. "My wife is distraught, Inspector. It's easy to lose track of time in such circumstances." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. Eleanor's hesitation, she thought, was not just nerves. It was the mark of someone caught in a lie, however small. She recalled the way Eleanor had glanced at her husband during the interviews, as though seeking his approval, and wondered what secret they shared. Craddock's attention shifted to Sylvia Grey, whose beauty seemed fragile in the dim light. "Miss Grey, you found the body, but your story about the shawl raises questions. The library is an odd place to leave such a valuable item. Are you certain that's why you went there?" Sylvia's fingers tightened on her shawl, her voice trembling. "I told you, I'd been reading there earlier. I didn't think anything of it. I just found her." Captain Haverford stepped forward, his tone protective. "That's enough, Inspector. Sylvia's been through enough. She's not a criminal." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, his gaze moving to Miss Vernon. "And you, Miss Vernon, seem remarkably observant. Did you notice anything else during those critical minutes?" Miss Vernon's needles resumed their clicking, her eyes glinting, only that people were coming and going more than they admit. "I saw Eleanor slip out, and Lionel was certainly near the door. And Sylvia, well, she's not as innocent as she looks, fluttering about with that shawl." Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "That's unfair, Clara. I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the venom in Miss Vernon's tone. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Price Ridley, who had a similar knack for stirring trouble with a well-placed word, often revealing more than she intended. Miss Vernon's accusations, she suspected, were not entirely disinterested. The Reverend Blackwood spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Let us not judge too hastily. We're all shaken, and it's easy to misremember in such times." Craddock nodded, though his expression remained sceptical. "Perhaps, but I'll need more than alibis. The note found in the library, about a meeting to discuss the will, suggests Mrs. Ashbourne had a purpose in going there. Who was she meeting?" A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind turning over the clues, the note, the scuff mark on the windowsill, the underlined passage in Macbeth, and now the word guilt in the margin. She thought of the petal she had seen on the dining-room table, its bruised edge so like the smudge on the library rug. And then there was the figure in the garden, seen by the groundskeeper, a shadow that might hold the key. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Might I suggest examining the garden path more closely? The window was open, and there may be traces, footprints perhaps, that could clarify things." Craddock looked at her, his eyes narrowing with interest. "A good suggestion, Miss Marple. I'll have my men check at first light. For now, I advise you all to get some rest. We'll continue tomorrow." As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy on the oak stairs, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the fire. She thought of the tensions she had observed, Lionel's desperation, Sylvia's evasiveness, Eleanor's fear, and Miss Vernon's sharp tongue. Each had a secret, she was certain, and one of those secrets had led to murder. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's lie about a bicycle had unravelled a far greater crime. Here, at Letherby Grange, the lies were piling up, but Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a dropped stitch, would eventually show itself. Chapter 8. The Crack in the Facade. The morning sun rose over Letherby Grange, its golden rays filtering through the mist that clung to the gardens of Chipping Cleghorn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading roses, but within the manor, the atmosphere remained heavy with suspicion and dread. The ormolu clock in the drawing-room struck 8 a.m., its chimes echoing through the silent house as the guests gathered for breakfast, their faces drawn from a sleepless night. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, observed the group with her characteristic quiet intensity, her eyes noting every strange smile and furtive glance. Inspector Craddock had arrived early, his demeanour brisk as he conferred with his sergeant in the hall. The police had spent the night combing the grounds, and their findings, he announced, had raised new questions. "The garden path beneath the library window shows signs of disturbance," he said, addressing the group as they sat around the dining table. "There are footprints, faint but clear enough, in the flower bed. They suggest someone may have entered or left through the window." A murmur rippled through the guests. Lionel Ashbourne's fork paused mid-air, his face paling. "Footprints," he said, his voice tight. "But that could mean an outsider. Someone from the village, perhaps." "Possibly," Craddock replied, his eyes narrowing. "But the prints are fresh, and the groundskeeper saw no strangers on the property yesterday. Whoever left them knew the house well enough to move quickly." Sylvia Grey's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, and Captain Haverford's arm instinctively moved to steady her. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice gruff. "No one in this house would do such a thing. You're barking up the wrong tree, Inspector." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, noting the protective edge in Haverford's tone. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Clement, who had once remarked that men often revealed their fears through their gallantry. Haverford's defence of Sylvia, she suspected, was not entirely selfless. Dr. Cedric Marlowe cleared his throat, his voice calm but measured. "Inspector, have you considered the staff? Parsons, for instance. He's been here for years. He'd know every inch of the house." Eleanor Marlowe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Cedric, how could you suggest such a thing?" Parsons has been loyal to Lavinia forever. Has he?" Miss Clara Vernon interjected, her knitting needles clicking softly from her seat. "Loyalty can mask resentment, my dear. I've heard whispers in the village. Parsons wasn't pleased when Lavinia cut his wages last year." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over this new piece of information. She recalled Parsons' pale face and frayed composure the previous day, and wondered if his loyalty had indeed been tested. She made a mental note to speak with him privately, perhaps under the guise of asking about the house's history. Craddock's gaze moved to the Reverend Timothy Blackwood, who had been silent, his eyes fixed on his untouched plate. "Reverend, you were near the window yesterday afternoon. Did you see anything in the garden? Any movement, any figure?" Blackwood blinked, as though startled from a reverie. I'm afraid I was lost in thought," he said, his voice gentle. "My Bible was open, and I was reflecting on a passage. I didn't notice the garden." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. The Reverend's absent-mindedness, she thought, was too convenient. She recalled the way his lips had moved silently during the previous night's gathering, as though praying, or perhaps rehearsing. People like Timothy Blackwood, she knew, often hid their sharpest observations behind a mask of distraction. It was then that Eleanor Marlowe's composure cracked. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. "I can't stand this any more," she cried, her voice trembling. "All these accusations, all these questions. I saw something, all right. I didn't want to say, but I can't keep it in any longer." The room fell silent, every eye on Eleanor. Dr. Marlowe reached for her hand, his expression a mixture of concern and alarm. "Eleanor, darling, what are you talking about?" Eleanor's breath came in short gasps, her hands twisting together. "When I went to the powder room, I passed the library door. It was ajar, and I heard voices, Lavinia's and someone else's. They were arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now— Oh, Cedric, what if I heard the killer?" Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Mrs. Marlowe, this is crucial. Did you recognize the other voice? Was it male or female?" Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. It was low, muffled. I was in such a hurry I didn't stop to listen. I wish I had." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was racing. Eleanor's confession, she thought, was both a breakthrough and a complication. An argument in the library suggested premeditation, not a spur-of-the-moment act. She thought of the note about the will, the underlined passage in Macbeth, and the word guilt in the margin. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was still incomplete. Craddock made a note, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mrs. Marlowe. That's helpful. If anyone else has something to add, now's the time." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Lionel's face was ashen, his eyes fixed on the table. Sylvia's fingers tightened on her shawl, and Captain Haverford's jaw clenched. Miss Vernon's needles resumed their rhythm. Her lips curled in a faint, knowing smile. The Reverend Blackwood's hands stilled on his Bible, his eyes distant but alert. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Inspector, might I suggest speaking with the groundskeeper again? He mentioned a figure in the garden. Perhaps he recalls more details. Clothing, perhaps, or the direction they moved." Craddock nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of respect. "I'll do that, Miss Marple, and I'll have the footprints analysed further. For now, I ask you all to remain here. No one leaves the Grange." As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy with unease, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the roses in the centrepiece. Another petal had fallen, its edge curled like the one she had seen the previous night. She thought of the smudge on the library rug, the scuff mark on the sill, and now Eleanor's confession. The truth, she knew, was like a garden, carefully tended, but with weeds that betrayed the gardener's secrets. At Leatherby Grange, the weeds were growing, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth them. Chapter 9. The Web Tightens. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Leatherby Grange, casting long, dappled shadows across the drawing-room, where the guests had gathered once more. The ormolu clock on the mantel read 10 a.m., its steady ticking a counterpoint to the strained silence that hung over the group. The events of the previous night, Eleanor Marlowe's tearful confession about hearing voices in the library, had left the guests restless, their eyes darting with suspicion and fear. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her serene expression masking the sharp calculations of her mind. Inspector Craddock stood at the centre of the room, his notebook open, his face etched with determination. "I've spoken with the groundskeeper again," he announced, his voice steady. "He confirms the figure he saw in the garden at 3:45 p.m. was wearing dark clothing, possibly a coat or cloak, and moved quickly toward the library window. The footprints in the flower bed match a man's shoe, size 10, though the tread is too worn to identify the make." A murmur rippled through the group. Lionel Ashbourne shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tugging at his collar. "A man's shoe," he said, his voice sharp. "That could be anyone. Some vagrant from the village, perhaps." "Unlikely," Craddock replied, his eyes narrowing. "The grounds are walled, and the gate was locked. Whoever left those prints was already on the property, or had access to it." Captain Haverford's jaw tightened, his arms crossed. "You're suggesting one of us, Inspector. That's absurd. I was in the hall fetching my pipe, as I said. I didn't go near the garden." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze flickering to Haverford. His defensiveness, she thought, was telling, not because it proved guilt, but because it suggested fear. She recalled her old friend Miss Weatherby, who had once noted that men like Haverford, accustomed to command, often bristled when their authority was questioned. Sylvia Grey, seated near the fire, clutched her shawl tightly, her face pale. "It's dreadful to think someone was out there, watching us," she said, her voice trembling. "What if they're still here?" Dr. Cedric Marlowe adjusted his spectacles, his tone measured. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Miss Grey. The footprints could belong to a servant, or even Parsons. He's often in the garden, isn't he?" Eleanor Marlowe's hand tightened on her husband's arm, her eyes wide. "Not Parsons! He's been with Lavinia for years. He wouldn't—" Miss Clara Vernon's knitting needles clicked sharply, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Loyalty is a thin veneer, Eleanor. I've heard Parsons grumbling about his wages more than once, and he's strong enough to wield that candlestick." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the way Miss Vernon's accusations seemed to stir the group, like a stone thrown into a still pond. She thought of the note about the will, the underlined passage in Macbeth, and the word guilt in the margin. The pieces were beginning to align, though the pattern was not yet clear. Craddock turned to the Reverend Timothy Blackwood, who sat quietly, his Bible open on his lap. "Reverend, you've been remarkably silent. You were near the window yesterday. Are you certain you saw nothing in the garden?" Blackwood's hands stilled, his eyes meeting Craddock's with a calm that seemed almost studied. "I'm afraid I was lost in my reading," he said softly. "The Psalms are a great comfort in troubled times, but I do recall a shadow, perhaps a bird, or the wind in the trees. I paid it no mind." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind turning over the Reverend's words. His vagueness, she thought, was too precise, like a man who had rehearsed his lines. She made a mental note to observe him more closely, perhaps during one of his quiet moments in the chapel. It was then that Parsons entered, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he carried a tray of coffee. The room fell silent, every eye on the butler as he set the tray on the table. Miss Marple noted the way his gaze darted toward the library door, as though expecting to see Mrs. Ashbourne emerge. She rose, her movement slow, and approached him under the guise of fetching a cup. "Parsons," she said gently, "you must be terribly shaken. Mrs. Ashbourne was fortunate to have such a devoted servant. Did she ever speak to you about her plans? Perhaps a change in her will?" Parsons' eyes widened briefly, then dropped to the tray. "No, madam," he said, his voice low. "Madam never discussed such matters with me. She was private about her affairs." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But you see so much in a house like this. Did you notice anyone near the library yesterday, before the tragedy?" Parsons hesitated, his fingers tightening on the tray. "I was in the pantry, madam, preparing tea. I didn't see anything unusual." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Parsons' hesitation, she thought, was a crack in his otherwise impeccable facade. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a butler's loyalty had masked a deeper grievance, and wondered if Parsons' devotion to Mrs. Ashbourne had been tested by more than just reduced wages. As Parsons retreated, Craddock addressed the group once more. "I'll be blunt," he said. "The note about the will suggests Mrs. Ashbourne was meeting someone in the library. That person may be the killer. If anyone knows anything at all, now is the time to speak." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Lionel's face was ashen, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sylvia's fingers twisted in her shawl, and Captain Haverford's posture stiffened. Eleanor's breath hitched, and Dr. Marlowe's hand tightened on hers. Miss Vernon's needles clicked, her gaze darting from one guest to another. The Reverend Blackwood's lips moved silently, as though in prayer. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the clues, the footprints, the note, the scuff mark, the petal, and now Parsons' hesitation. She thought of Eleanor's confession about the voices, and the shadow the Reverend had mentioned, however vaguely. The web was tightening, she knew, and the killer was growing careless. She recalled her old friend, Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had once said that secrets were like shadows. They followed you everywhere, but they only showed themselves in the right light. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, "might I suggest examining the candlestick again? There may be something, a mark perhaps, that could tell us more about how it was handled." Craddock nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of respect. "I'll have it dusted for prints again, Miss Marple, and I'll speak with Parsons privately. For now, I ask you all to remain here. The truth is close. I can feel it." as the guests dispersed, their faces heavy with unease. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the coffee tray. A single sugar cube had fallen to the floor, its edges slightly crushed, like the petal on the dining table. She smiled faintly, knowing that the smallest details often held the greatest truths. At Letherby Grange, the truth was stirring, and Miss Marple was ready to coax it into the light. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The afternoon sun hung low over Letherby Grange, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns and deepening the shadows within the manor's stately rooms. The ormolu clock in the drawing-room struck 3 p.m., its chimes echoing through the tense silence that had settled over the guests. The weight of Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder pressed heavily on all, and the air was thick with suspicion, each glance and gesture laden with unspoken accusations. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the window, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, her serene demeanour a stark contrast to the agitation around her. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing. The way Lionel Ashbourne's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the way Sylvia Grey's fingers clutched her shawl, and the way Eleanor Marlowe's gaze darted nervously toward her husband. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression one of quiet determination. The morning's revelations, the footprints in the flower bed, Eleanor's confession about the voices, and Parsons' hesitation had tightened the net around the suspects, and Craddock was ready to apply pressure. "I've called you all here," he began, his voice calm but firm, "because the evidence is mounting, and someone in this room is not telling the truth. Tonight, we will reconstruct the events leading up to Mrs. Ashbourne's death. I want each of you to walk me through your movements from 3:45 to 4:02 p.m. yesterday." A murmur of protest rose, but Craddock raised a hand to silence it. "This is not a request. The killer is among us, and I intend to find them. Miss Marple, I understand you've been observing closely. Would you care to assist?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up with a gentle smile. "Oh, Inspector, I'm merely an old woman with a knack for noticing things. But I'd be happy to help, if only to clarify the little details." Her modesty drew a faint smile from Craddock, who knew better than to underestimate her. He turned to the group. "We'll start in the drawing-room and move to the library. Let's begin with you, Mr. Ashbourne." Lionel stubbed out his cigarette, his face pale but defiant. "I've told you, I was here the whole time. I stood up to stretch my legs, but I didn't leave the room." Miss Vernon's needles clicked sharply, her voice cutting. "That's not what I saw, Lionel. You were near the library door, and you were gone for several minutes." Lionel's eyes flashed with anger. "You're mistaken, Clara. I know you'd love to see me in trouble, but I didn't go near the library." Miss Marple's gaze flickered between them, noting the venom in their exchange. She thought of the note about the will, tucked beneath the inkwell, and wondered if Lionel's desperation had driven him to confront his aunt. She made a mental note to ask about his financial dealings, perhaps through the village solicitor, who might know more than he let on. Craddock moved to Sylvia Grey, whose auburn hair gleamed in the sunlight. "Miss Grey, you said you went to the library to fetch your shawl. Let's walk through that. Show me exactly where you went." Sylvia rose, her movements graceful but unsteady, and led the group to the library, where the scene remained untouched. save for the sheet covering Mrs. Ashbourne's body. The silver candlestick still lay on the rug, its base stained with blood, and the open copy of Macbeth rested nearby, its underlined passage a silent accusation. Sylvia pointed to a chair near the fireplace. "My shawl was there," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw it, and then I saw her." Miss Marple followed, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the faint smudge on the rug, the scuff mark on the windowsill, and the word guilt penciled in the margin of the book. She bent slightly, as though adjusting her shoe, and peered at the chair Sylvia had indicated. A single silk thread, barely visible, clung to the upholstery, a thread that matched Sylvia's shawl. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind racing. Had Sylvia been in the library earlier than she claimed? Or was the thread merely a coincidence? Craddock turned to Eleanor Marlowe, whose face was pale and drawn. "Mrs. Marlowe, you heard voices in the library. Show me where. You were standing when you passed the door." Eleanor hesitated, then led the group to the hallway, pointing to a spot near the powder room. "Here," she said, her voice barely audible. "The door was ajar, and I heard them arguing. I didn't stop. I was in a hurry." Dr. Marlowe placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his voice calm. "My wife was upset, Inspector. It's natural she didn't linger." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her thoughts were sharp. Eleanor's story, she thought, was plausible, but the tremor in her voice suggested she was holding something back. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's half-truth had hidden a deeper secret, and wondered what Eleanor feared to reveal. As the group returned to the drawing room, Craddock addressed Captain Haverford. "You were in the hall fetching your pipe. Show me your route." Haverford strode to the hall, his steps brisk, and pointed to a small table where his pipe rested. "I came here, grabbed it and returned. It took no more than a minute." Miss Marple noted the table's position, close to the library door, but not so close that Haverford would have necessarily heard an argument. She thought of the footprints in the garden, and the figure in dark clothing seen by the groundskeeper. Haverford's sturdy frame and military boots, she mused, could easily match a size 10 shoe. The Reverend Blackwood was last, his gentle voice describing his position by the window, his Bible open to the Psalms. "I was reading," he said, his eyes distant. "I saw nothing, though I recall a shadow in the garden, as I told you." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over the clues, the thread, the note, the footprints, the voices, and the word guilt. She thought of the petal on the dining table, its bruised edge so like the smudge on the rug, and the faint scent of lavender that clung to the note. The trap was set, she knew, and the killer was growing careless under the pressure of Craddock's questions and her own quiet observations. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "might I suggest gathering everyone in the library tonight? There's something about the room, the way the light falls, perhaps, that might jog a memory. People often recall things when they're back in the place where it happened." Craddock's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "A good idea, Miss Marple. We'll reconvene at 8 p.m. Until then, no one leaves the house." As the guests dispersed, their faces heavy with unease, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the ormolu clock. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once said that a trap was only as good as the bait. At Letherby Grange, The bait was the truth, and Miss Marple was determined to see who would take it. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. As the clock in the drawing-room of Letherby Grange struck 8 p.m., the guests assembled in the library. Their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the chandelier, the room still heavy with the memory of Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder, seemed to close in around them. Its leather-bound books and polished oak surfaces bearing silent witness to the tragedy. The silver candlestick, now in police custody, had been replaced by its twin on the mantel, and the open copy of Macbeth lay undisturbed on the floor, its underlined passage a haunting reminder of the crime. Miss Jane Marple stood near the window, her knitting bag at her feet, her serene demeanour masking the sharp calculations of her mind. Inspector Craddock stood at the centre of the room, his presence commanding as he addressed the group. "Thank you for gathering here," he said, his voice steady but edged with purpose. "Miss Marple suggested we return to the scene of the crime, and I agree. Sometimes being in the place where it happened can stir the truth. I want each of you to think carefully about what you saw, heard or did between 3:45 and 4:02 p.m. yesterday. The smallest detail could be the key." The guests stood or sat in a loose semicircle, their postures tense. Lionel Ashbourne leaned against the oak desk, his face pale and his fingers fidgeting with a cigarette he dared not light. Sylvia Grey sat near the fireplace, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes wide with apprehension. Captain Ralph Haverford stood by her side, his arms crossed, his jaw set as though bracing for battle. Dr. Cedric Marlowe and his wife Eleanor sat close together, her hand clutching his, her face pale. Miss Clara Vernon perched on a velvet chair, her knitting needles silent for once, her gaze sharp and unyielding. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood stood near the bookcase, his Bible tucked under his arm, his expression one of quiet sorrow. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the group, noting the way Lionel avoided Craddock's gaze, the way Sylvia's fingers twisted in her shawl, and the way Eleanor's breath hitched at every mention of the library. She thought of the clues that had accumulated, the note about the will, the smudge on the rug, the scuff mark on the windowsill, the underlined passage in Macbeth, the word guilt in the margin, the silk thread on the chair, and the footprints in the garden. The pattern was nearly complete, she knew, but one piece was still missing, a piece that would tie the web together. Craddock began with Sylvia. "Miss Grey, you found Mrs. Ashbourne's body. Walk us through it again, every step, every moment." Sylvia rose, her movements hesitant, and retraced her path to the chair near the fireplace. "I came in here," she said, her voice trembling. "My shawl was on that chair. I saw it, and then I saw her on the floor. I screamed, and everyone came running." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the chair, where the silk thread had caught her eye earlier. She stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Miss Grey, your shawl is quite lovely. You said you'd left it here earlier while reading. Do you often leave such a fine piece lying about?" Sylvia flushed, her hands tightening on the shawl. I suppose I was careless. I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were sharp. She thought of a young woman in St. Mary Mead who had once lied about a lost scarf to cover a rendezvous, and wondered if Sylvia's carelessness was as innocent as she claimed. Craddock turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Marlowe, You heard voices in the library. Can you recall anything more about them? Any word? Any tone?" Eleanor's eyes darted to her husband, who nodded encouragingly. I'm not sure," she stammered. "It was muffled, like they were trying to keep quiet. I thought I heard Lavinia say something about the truth, but I couldn't be certain." Dr. Marlowe's hand tightened on hers, his voice calm but firm. "My wife was upset, Inspector. It's easy to mishear in such a moment." Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, moved slowly. She noted the way, Doctor. Marlowe's composure never wavered, as though he were shielding Eleanor, or perhaps himself. She thought of the note about the will, and the lavender scent that clung to it, so like the potpourri in the drawing-room. Craddock moved to Lionel. "Mr. Ashbourne, Miss Vernon insists you left the drawing-room. Are you still claiming you stayed put?" Lionel's face darkened, his voice sharp. "Clara's wrong. I was in the drawing-room, as I said. I didn't go near the library." Miss Vernon's lips curled into a faint smile. "My eyes don't lie, Lionel. You were near the door, and you were gone long enough to do, well, anything." Lionel's hands clenched, but before he could retort, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, might I ask about the candlestick? You mentioned it was dusted for prints again. Were there any results?" Craddock's eyes met hers, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "Yes, Miss Marple. We found partial prints, smudged, but consistent with someone holding it tightly. They don't match any of the staff, which narrows our focus to this room." A gasp rippled through the group. Sylvia's hand flew to her throat, and Captain Haverford's posture stiffened. Eleanor's breath caught, and Lionel's cigarette fell to the floor, unlit. Miss Vernon's smile widened, as though she relished the rising tension. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the scuff mark on the sill caught the light. "And the footprints in the garden?" she asked. "Have they been matched to any shoes in the house?" Craddock nodded. "We're checking the guests' footwear now. The tread is distinctive, worn, but with a clear pattern. We'll have answers soon." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the clues. The footprints, she thought, were the key, not because they proved who entered the library, but because they suggested someone wanted it to appear that an outsider had committed the crime. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a staged burglary had masked a far more personal motive, and wondered if the same deception was at play here. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe we are close to the truth. The note about the will, the voices Mrs. Marlowe heard, the footprints, the candlestick, all point to someone who knew Mrs. Ashbourne's habits intimately. I suggest we consider not just who was where, but why Mrs. Ashbourne went to the library at all. That note, it was a lure, I think." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "A lure? You mean someone planned to meet her and kill her?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "And I believe if we look closely at the motives, money, love, betrayal, we will find our answer." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group like a storm cloud. Lionel's face was ashen, Sylvia's eyes wide with fear, and Eleanor's hands trembled in her husband's grasp. Miss Vernon's smile faded, and the Reverend Blackwood's lips stilled, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple as though seeing her for the first time. Craddock clapped his hands together. "Very well. We'll continue our inquiries, and I expect full cooperation. No one leaves this house until we have answers." As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy with dread, Miss Marple remained, her gaze resting on the open copy of Macbeth. The word guilt in the margin seemed to pulse in the dim light. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once said that the truth was like a storm. It gathered slowly, but when it broke, it changed everything. At Letherby Grange, the storm was gathering, and Miss Marple was ready for the deluge. Chapter 12. The Unravelling Thread. The library at Letherby Grange was bathed in the soft glow of the evening lamps, their light casting intricate shadows across the leather-bound books and polished oak surfaces. The ormolu clock in the drawing-room, audible through the open door, struck 9 p.m., its chimes a solemn reminder of the time that had passed since Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder. The guests, summoned once more by Inspector Craddock, stood or sat in uneasy silence, their faces etched with the strain of suspicion and sleeplessness. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, appeared as serene as ever, but her eyes were sharp, cataloguing every nuance of the scene. The way Lionel Ashbourne's cigarette trembled in his hand, the way Sylvia Grey's shawl slipped slightly from her shoulders, and the way Eleanor Marlowe's gaze clung to her husband as though he were her anchor. Inspector Craddock stood by the oak desk, his notebook open, his expression one of quiet resolve. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the room itself sensed that the truth was drawing near. "We've made progress," Craddock announced, his voice steady. "The footprints in the garden have been matched to a pair of shoes. Size 10, worn tread, found in Captain Haverford's room." A gasp rippled through the group. Captain Haverford's face reddened, his fists clenching. "That's preposterous!" he barked. "I told you, I was in the hall fetching my pipe. I didn't go near the garden." Sylvia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Ralph, you couldn't have." Haverford turned to her, his voice softening but urgent. "I swear, Sylvia, I had nothing to do with it. Those shoes, they're old. Anyone could have taken them." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her gaze flickering to Haverford. His outrage, she thought, was genuine, but there was a note of fear beneath it, as though he suspected someone had deliberately implicated him. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a pair of gloves had been planted to cast suspicion, and wondered if a similar deception was at play here. Craddock held up a hand for silence. "We're not accusing anyone yet, Captain, but the evidence is compelling. We also found a trace of garden soil on the library rug near the window, soil that matches the flower bed outside. Someone entered or left through that window, and the shoes suggest it was you." Lionel Ashbourne's voice cut through the tension, sharp and accusing. "This is ridiculous! If anyone had a reason to kill Aunt Lavinia, it wasn't Haverford. What about Parsons? Or Clara, with her endless snooping?" Miss Clara Vernon's lips curled into a thin smile, her eyes glinting. "Careful, Lionel. Your desperation is showing. We all know your investments went sour. How badly did you need Lavinia's money?" Lionel's face flushed, but before he could retort, Dr. Marlowe spoke, his voice calm but firm. "This bickering serves no purpose. Inspector, have you considered the note about the will? It suggests Lavinia was meeting someone who stood to gain." Eleanor Marlowe's breath hitched, her hands twisting together. "Cedric, please, don't make it worse." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting Eleanor's distress. She thought of the voices Eleanor had heard, and the lavender-scented note tucked beneath the inkwell. The will, she suspected, was at the heart of the matter, but the motive was not as simple as money. It was tangled with deeper, more personal betrayals. Craddock turned to the Reverend Timothy Blackwood, who stood quietly by the bookcase, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Reverend, you mentioned a shadow in the garden. Can you recall anything more? Perhaps a detail you overlooked?" Blackwood's eyes flickered, his voice gentle but hesitant. I'm not certain. It was fleeting, like a figure moving quickly. I thought it was the groundskeeper, but now I wonder." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The Reverend's hesitation, she thought, was not mere absent-mindedness. It was the caution of someone who had seen more than he wished to admit. She recalled her old friend Miss Hartnell, who had once said that the quietest people often held the loudest secrets, and made a mental note to speak with Blackwood alone. Craddock's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Miss Marple, you've been quiet. Any thoughts on these developments?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but clear. "Only that the truth is like a thread, Inspector. Pull it gently, and the whole tapestry unravels. The footprints, the soil, the note, they all point to a careful plan, but one that was not quite careful enough. I wonder, for instance, about the candlestick. It's heavy, yet the blow was precise. That suggests strength, but also control. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Lionel's cigarette fell to the floor, unlit, and Sylvia's shawl slipped further, revealing the emerald ring on her finger. Eleanor's hands trembled, and Dr. Marlowe's jaw tightened. Miss Vernon's smile faded, her eyes narrowing, while Blackwood's fingers tightened on his Bible. Craddock nodded, his eyes scanning the group. Miss Marple's right. The killer made a mistake, perhaps several, and I believe they're in this room. Tonight, I'm setting a trap. I've asked Parsons to bring Mrs. Ashbourne's will from her safe. We'll read it here, together, and see what it reveals." A murmur of shock rippled through the group. Sylvia's eyes widened, and Haverford's posture stiffened. Lionel's face drained of colour, and Eleanor's breath caught. Miss Vernon's needles remained still, her gaze fixed on Craddock with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over the clues, the silk thread, the scuff mark, the note, the word guilt, and now the will. She thought of the petal on the dining table, its bruised edge so like the smudge on the rug, and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to linger everywhere. The trap, she knew, was not just Craddock's, it was hers as well, woven from the threads of observation and intuition. As Parsons entered, carrying a sealed envelope, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the slight tremor in his hands, and she thought of her old friend Mrs. Price Ridley, who had once said that the truth was like a needle in a haystack, hard to find, but impossible to ignore once it pricked you. At Letherby Grange, the needle was close, and Miss Marple was ready to feel its sting. Chapter 13. The Will Revealed. The library at Letherby Grange was a cauldron of tension, the air thick with anticipation, as the guests stood or sat in a taut semicircle around Inspector Craddock. The chandeliers, Light cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the oak desk where Parsons had placed the sealed envelope containing Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's will. The ormolu clock, faintly audible from the drawing-room, struck 9:30 p.m., its chimes a sombre prelude to the revelations about to unfold. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, appeared as serene as ever. But her eyes were sharp, noting every flicker of unease. Lionel Ashbourne's clenched fists, Sylvia Grey's trembling hands, and Eleanor Marlowe's pale, drawn face. Craddock held the envelope, his expression grave. "This is Mrs. Ashbourne's will, retrieved from her safe by Parsons under my supervision," he said, his voice steady. "It was last updated 3 weeks ago, according to her solicitor. I believe its contents may shed light on why she was killed. I'll read it aloud, and I expect your full attention." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lionel's cigarette, forgotten in his hand, sent a thin wisp of smoke curling upward. Sylvia's shawl slipped from her shoulders, revealing the emerald ring that gleamed in the lamplight. Captain Haverford stood rigidly by her side, his eyes fixed on Craddock. Dr. Marlowe's hand rested on Eleanor's, his composure unshaken, while Miss Clara Vernon's gaze was piercing, her knitting needles still for once. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood clutched his Bible, his lips moving silently, as though in prayer. Craddock broke the seal and began to read. Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's will is straightforward. The bulk of her estate, Letherby Grange, her investments, and her personal effects, is left to her nephew, Lionel Ashbourne, with the condition that he maintain the estate as a family home. Smaller bequests are made to the church, to be administered by the Reverend Blackwood, and to the village hospital, under Dr. Marlowe's oversight. There is also a sum for Parsons, in recognition of his long service, and a modest annuity for Miss Clara Vernon, for her companionship over the years. A murmur rippled through the group. Lionel's shoulders sagged, as though a weight had been lifted, but his eyes remained wary. Miss Vernon's lips tightened, her expression one of barely concealed resentment. Eleanor's breath hitched, and Dr. Marlowe's hand tightened on hers. Sylvia's eyes darted to Haverford, who frowned, his jaw clenching. Craddock paused, his eyes scanning the group. "There's one more provision. A codicil, added 3 weeks ago, leaves a significant sum, £10,000, to Miss Sylvia Grey, described as a dear friend who brought joy in recent years." Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Me! But I had no idea!" Haverford's face darkened, his voice low and sharp. "Sylvia, you never mentioned this. What did you do to earn £10,000? "Nothing," Sylvia cried, her voice trembling. "Lavinia was kind to me, that's all. We talked often. She said I reminded her of her youth." Miss Marple's needles moved slowly, her gaze fixed on Sylvia. The codicil, she thought, was a surprise, but not an unexpected one. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where her generous bequest had sparked jealousy and betrayal, and wondered if Sylvia's charm had stirred more than affection in Mrs. Ashbourne's heart. Craddock folded the will, his eyes narrowing. "This gives us a clearer picture. Money is a powerful motive, and several of you stood to gain, or lose, by Mrs. Ashbourne's death. Mr. Ashbourne, your inheritance was secure, but only if you kept the estate. Were you aware of the codicil?" Lionel shook his head, his voice hoarse. "Number, I knew Aunt Lavinia was fond of Sylvia, but £10,000? That's unexpected." Miss Vernon's voice cut through, sharp and accusing. Unexpected, Lionel, or inconvenient? We all know you've been borrowing against the estate. Did you fear Lavinia was giving too much away? Lionel's face flushed, his fists clenching. That's slander, Clara. I loved my aunt. I'd never harm her. Craddock turned to Sylvia. Miss Grey, did Mrs. Ashbourne ever discuss this bequest with you, or mention any concerns about her will? Sylvia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Never. She was kind, generous. I didn't know about the money. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Sylvia's ring, its emerald catching the light. She thought of the silk thread on the library chair, the lavender-scented note, and the word guilt in the margin of Macbeth. The will, she suspected, was the lure that had drawn Mrs. Ashbourne to the library. But the killer's motive was not just money. It was something deeper, more personal. Eleanor Marlowe's voice broke the silence, trembling but clear. Inspector, I need to tell you something. When I heard the voices in the library, I think one of them was Sylvia's. The room froze. Sylvia's eyes widened, her face paling. That's not true. I wasn't in the library until I found her. Haverford stepped forward, his voice booming. Eleanor, you're mistaken. Sylvia was with me in the drawing room until she went to fetch her shawl. Eleanor's hands twisted together, her eyes darting to her husband. I'm sorry, but I'm sure of it. It was her voice, soft but unmistakable. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Eleanor's accusation, she thought, was a turning point, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Had Sylvia been in the library earlier, arguing with Mrs. Ashbourne? Or was Eleanor's memory clouded by fear or malice? She thought of the footprints in the garden, matched to Haverford's shoes, and the smudge on the rug so like the bruised petal on the dining table. Craddock's eyes narrowed, his voice firm. Miss Grey, this is serious. If you were in the library before you claim, you need to explain yourself. Sylvia's tears spilled over, her voice breaking. I wasn't there. I swear it. Eleanor's lying or confused. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice cutting through the chaos. Inspector, might I suggest examining the library chair again? The one where Miss Grey's shawl was found. There may be something, a mark, a trace, that could clarify things. Craddock nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of understanding. Very well, Miss Marple. We'll look again. For now, I ask you all to remain here. The truth is close, and I won't let it slip away. As the guests stood, their faces heavy with fear and suspicion, Miss Marple's gaze rested on the open copy of Macbeth. The word guilt seemed to pulse in the dim light, a silent accusation. She thought of her old friend Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had once said that the truth was like a mirror. It reflected everything, but only if you looked at it straight. At Letherby Grange, the mirror was turning, and Miss Marple was ready to see what it revealed. Chapter 14. The Final Pieces. The library at Letherby Grange was steeped in an almost palpable tension, the flickering chandelier casting restless shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. The Ormolu clock's chimes, faintly audible from the drawing-room, marked 10 p.m., each note a reminder of the hours ticking by since Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder. The room, with its leather-bound books and polished oak, seemed to hold its breath. As Inspector Craddock stood by the oak desk, his eyes scanning the group with a quiet intensity. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, appeared as unassuming as ever. But her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Lionel Ashbourne's cigarette trembled in his hand. The way Sylvia Grey's shawl slipped further from her shoulders. And the way Eleanor Marlowe's fingers clutched her husband's arm. Craddock's voice broke the silence, steady but laced with purpose. "We're close to the truth," he said, his notebook open in his hand. "The will has clarified motives, but it's the details, the footprints, the note, the candlestick, that point to the killer." Miss Marple suggested we examine the chair where Miss Grey's shawl was found. "Sergeant, what did you find?" The young sergeant stepped forward, holding a small evidence bag. "There's a silk thread on the chair, sir, matching Miss Grey's shawl, and a faint mark on the armrest, like a smudge of ink." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze flickering to Sylvia, who paled visibly. "Ink!" Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I didn't touch anything." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "The ink matches the crystal inkwell on the desk, where we found the note about the will. Miss Grey, you claimed you only entered the library to fetch your shawl, but this suggests you were near the desk. Perhaps during the argument Mrs. Marlowe overheard." Sylvia's tears spilled over, her hands twisting in her shawl. "I wasn't there. I swear it. I didn't argue with Lavinia." Captain Haverford stepped forward, his voice booming. "This is nonsense, Inspector. Sylvia's no killer. You've got the wrong person." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was racing. The ink smudge, she thought, was a careless mistake, but it didn't necessarily point to Sylvia as the killer. It pointed to someone who had been at the desk, handling the note. She recalled the lavender scent that clung to the paper, so like the potpourri in the drawing room, and the word guilt penciled in the margin of Macbeth. The pieces were falling into place, but one final thread needed to be pulled. Craddock turned to Eleanor Marlowe, whose face was pale and drawn. "Mrs. Marlowe, you're certain it was Miss Grey's voice you heard in the library?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to her husband, who nodded encouragingly. I think so," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was soft like hers, but I was so nervous I could be mistaken." Dr. Marlowe's hand tightened on hers, his voice calm but firm. "My wife is under strain, Inspector. It's easy to mishear in such a moment." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts turning to Eleanor's hesitation. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a nervous young woman's half-truth had hidden a deeper fear, and wondered if Eleanor was protecting someone, perhaps her husband, whose composure seemed almost too perfect. Lionel Ashbourne's voice cut through, sharp and defensive. "Why are we focusing on Sylvia? What about those footprints? Haverford's shoes, you said. He had more reason than anyone, jealous of Sylvia's bequest, maybe." Haverford's face reddened, his fists clenching. "Watch your tongue, Ashbourne. I'd never harm Lavinia. Those shoes were in my room. Anyone could have used them." Miss Clara Vernon's lips curled into a faint smile, her voice sharp. "Anyone, Captain. Or someone who wanted to make it look like you were in the garden. You're not exactly subtle, stomping about like a soldier." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, noting Miss Vernon's knack for stirring discord. She thought of the smudge on the rug, the scuff mark on the window-sill, and the footprints in the garden. The killer, she suspected, had orchestrated a careful deception, planting clues to mislead. Yet they had overlooked the smallest details, like the ink smudge and the silk thread. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood spoke up, his voice gentle but hesitant. "Inspector, I must confess something. When I saw the shadow in the garden, it wasn't just a bird or the wind. I saw a figure in dark clothing near the library window. I didn't want to cause alarm, but I believe it was a woman." A gasp rippled through the group. Sylvia's eyes widened, and Eleanor's breath caught. Miss Vernon's smile faded, her hands stilling. Miss Marple's needles paused again, her mind racing. The Reverend's confession, she thought, was a turning point, but it raised new questions. A woman in the garden. The footprints were a man size 10, yet the figure was described as slight, perhaps disguised. Craddock's eyes met Miss Marple's, a silent acknowledgement of her influence. "Miss Marple, you've been observing closely. Any thoughts on this new information?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but clear. "Only that the truth is like a puzzle, Inspector. Each piece seems to fit until you see the whole picture. The footprints, the ink, the note, the voices, they all point to a plan, but one that was not quite clever enough. I wonder, for instance, about the lavender scent on the note. It's so like the potpourri in the drawing room, where we all sat. Someone wrote that note, and someone ensured Mrs. Ashbourne would go to the library." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Lionel's cigarette fell to the floor. Sylvia's shawl slipped entirely, and Eleanor's hands trembled in her husband's grasp. Miss Vernon's eyes narrowed, and Blackwood's lips stilled, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. Craddock nodded, his voice firm. "We're close. I'll have the shoes and the ink smudge analysed further, and I want statements from everyone about their exact movements. No one leaves this house until we have answers." As the guests stood, their faces heavy with fear and suspicion, Miss Marple's gaze rested on the open copy of Macbeth. The word guilt in the margin seemed to glow in the lamplight, a silent accusation. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Price Ridley, who had once said that the truth was like a weed. It grew in the cracks, where no one thought to look. At Letherby Grange, the cracks were widening, and Miss Marple was ready to unearth the truth. Chapter 15. The Truth Revealed. The library at Letherby Grange was cloaked in the hush of late evening, the chandelier's light casting a soft glow over the gathered guests who stood or sat in a tense semicircle around Inspector Craddock. The Ormolu clock's chimes, faintly audible from the drawing-room, struck 10:30 p.m., each note resonating like a heartbeat in the charged silence. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne's murder pressing heavily on all. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, appeared as serene as ever, but her eyes were bright and unyielding, noting every flicker of fear. Lionel Ashbourne's trembling hands, Sylvia Grey's pale face, and Eleanor Marlowe's nervous glances toward her husband. Craddock stood by the oak desk, his notebook closed, his expression one of quiet certainty. "We've reached the end of this puzzle," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "The clues, the note, the footprints, the ink smudge, the silk thread, the voices have led us to the truth. Miss Marple, your observations have been invaluable. Would you care to share your conclusions?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of conviction. "Thank you, Inspector. I've always found that the truth is like a tapestry. Each thread seems small, but together they form a picture. At Letherby Grange, the threads are clear, if one looks closely." She rose, her movements deliberate, and faced the group. "Mrs. Ashbourne was killed for a reason. Money, yes, but also something deeper. Betrayal." The note about the will scented with lavender was a lure to bring her to the library. The footprints in the garden, matched to Captain Haverford's shoes, were meant to mislead. The silk thread on the chair suggested Miss Grey's presence, but it was too convenient. And the word guilt in Macbeth. It was not a clue left by Mrs. Ashbourne, but a taunt from the killer. The guests froze, their eyes fixed on Miss Marple. Lionel's cigarette fell to the floor. Sylvia's shawl slipped entirely, and Eleanor's breath caught. Captain Haverford's fists clenched, and Miss Clara Vernon's gaze narrowed. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood's hands tightened on his Bible, his lips still. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but relentless. "The killer is someone who knew Mrs. Ashbourne's habits, who could move freely in this house, and who had a motive that went beyond money. I thought of my old friend Mrs. Bantry, who once said that secrets are like shadows. They follow you, but they only show in the right light. The light here is the lavender scent, the ink smudge, and the voices Mrs. Marlowe heard." She turned to Eleanor, her eyes kind but probing. "Mrs. Marlowe, you heard voices in the library, and you thought one was Miss Grey's. But you were protecting someone, weren't you? Your husband, Dr. Marlowe." Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Dr. Marlowe's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with alarm. "Miss Marple, that's absurd," he said, his voice calm but strained. "I was in the drawing-room with the others." "Were you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Mrs. Marlowe's hesitation, her fear, it wasn't just nerves, it was loyalty. You see, the lavender scent on the note matched the potpourri in the drawing-room where you sat. The ink smudge on the chair matched the inkwell on the desk, where you often wrote prescriptions. And the footprints. Captain Haverford's shoes were in your room, Doctor, because you borrowed them, didn't you? To create the illusion of an outsider. The room was deathly silent, the guests' faces pale with shock. Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he let Miss Marple continue. "You were in the library arguing with Mrs. Ashbourne," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "She had discovered your secret. An affair, perhaps, or a financial indiscretion. She threatened to cut you out of her will, to expose you. You wrote the note to lure her there, struck her with the candlestick, and planted the footprints to implicate Captain Haverford. The silk thread was a mistake. You brushed against the chair while staging the scene, perhaps when you moved Sylvia's shawl to make it seem she had been there." Dr. Marlowe's composure cracked, his hands trembling. "This is nonsense. You have no proof." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "The proof is in the details, Doctor. The ink on your cuff, barely noticeable, but there. The lavender scent on your handkerchief, which you used to wipe the candlestick, and Mrs. Marlowe's fear. She heard your voice, not a Sylvia's, and she's been protecting you ever since." Eleanor sobbed, her hands covering her face. "Cedric, I'm sorry, I didn't want to believe it." Dr. Marlowe's shoulders slumped, his face ashen. "It wasn't planned," he said, his voice low. "Lavinia found out about my debts. She was going to ruin me, tell everyone. I only meant to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. I lost control." Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Dr. Cedric Marlowe, You're under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Lavinia Ashbourne." As the sergeant handcuffed Marlowe, the guests stood in stunned silence. Sylvia's tears fell freely, and Haverford's arm went around her. Lionel's cigarette lay forgotten, and Miss Vernon's lips pursed, her eyes glinting with reluctant admiration. Blackwood's head bowed in prayer. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her expression serene. "It's always the small things," she said softly, almost to herself. "A scent, a smudge, a word. They tell the story if you listen." Craddock nodded, his eyes meeting hers with respect. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. I don't know how you see what we miss." She smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "I only observe, Inspector. People are so very human, and humans are never quite as clever as they think." As the guests dispersed, their faces heavy with relief and sorrow, Miss Marple gazed out the window at the moonlit garden. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had once said that the truth was like a light. It shone brightest in the darkest moments. At Letherby Grange, the light had shone and the truth had been revealed.